Thanks for coming. My name is Annie. I'm a UX consultant. I work in Antwerp, Belgium. And I was asked here today because I spent 2 years at the European Commission helping to set up a digital transformation program for them. I was originally assigned to be the UX lead, and I thought I would be doing a lot of design work, or at least a lot of interesting work with users to try to come up with a new concept for how they want to communicate digitally with their users. But what it ended up being was actually completely different than what I thought. I spent a couple of years really just setting up a program, helping to guide research, and spending very little time with design. But anyway, it was a very exciting project, so I'll dig into that. Originally, I'm from Portland, Oregon. It's a little funny because I'm always listed as an international contributor, but I'm very local. But anyway, we'll get on with that. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of background information. Background information on the European Union. I promise it won't be too academic, but a lot of this is just stuff that I didn't know when I first started working there, and I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the EU, obviously, it's a governing body of 27 governments. They focus more or less on the really big stuff, helping to align national governments. So things like migration and a common policy on climate change, energy, about sharing utilities and resources over borders, things like that. So they really have a large scope. There's 14 government institutions in the EU, and I'll bet you your average European citizen could not name all 14. But the Commission itself, the one that I work for, can largely be compared mainly to the executive branch of the US government. They're the political arm. And they do have a president, and they're governed by 28 commissioners that are appointed from each of the member countries. It promotes the political priorities of the EU, so they're a very political organization. They also help write legislation, and they enforce policy. So they do quite a lot. Their scope of work is really large. You may have heard in the media the EU gets a lot of criticism sometimes for being a little bit navel-gazing, maybe being a little bit too out of touch with the average citizen, a bit sitting in their ivory tower. They have a nickname in Europe called Brussels bubble, and it's actually quite, bear with me, it's quite apparent because you can see the logo of the European Commission actually includes the building in Brussels where a lot of where the president sits. So, oh, thank you very much. That's louder. Let's see. They are also, excuse me, I have to keep going back and forth. They're the political face of the EU, and they're also the largest institution in the EU. They have nearly 50,000 employees if you count contractors as well, so it's really the size of like a small city. They're responsible for spending most of the money of the EU. They control about 80% of the EU budget, and they fund massive programs, massive policy programs. They fund tons of research grants. If you're a researcher in the world, you're most likely going after research grants that are funded by the EU. They're also the spokesperson, so if you ever see someone on the news talking about the EU in an official capacity, generally they're from the Commission itself. And they're also not elected democratically. All of their leadership is appointed. So when you think about public perception, the Commission is really the behemoth of the EU. They're massive, they're expensive, they control a lot of money, they're very visible in the media, and they're not democratically elected. And you can really feel this vibe when you walk around the institution. They really want to be connecting to the citizens, but they're also very aware of just the size and complexity of their organization and how constraining and crushing it can really be on having a good relationship with their users. And also just when it comes to UX and trying to manage their communication, they're also, since they're a political body, that can also be challenging. They have term limits, so they leave after 4 years. They have a very campaign, sort of speech writing focus, so they tend to be a little bit trumpeters and spend a little more time kind of talking at people rather than listening to people. And they have to react very quickly to public opinion and public shifts. So it's very difficult to set up a long-term strategy or even talk about a long-term relationship with users just because of that. Now, the commission is divided into 42 departments that mostly deal with policy areas, agriculture, trade, energy, that kind of thing. But for the most part, these departments operate completely independently in their own silos. They have their own structure, their own governance, and that means they also manage all of their own communication completely independently from each other. So there's 42 different communications departments, 42 different web teams, and they all just do whatever they want. There is a communications department, but again, it's just kind of one of the silos. There's not really any overarching authority that they have on the departments, and the departments don't have to do anything that the communications departments, that the comms department says. So when working for the commission, it can feel very easy to get, it can feel very lonely and that you're a bit lost in this sea of bureaucracy and organization. And that's exactly how we felt when we first started. We were sponsored by the communications department, but we were also working in cooperation with IT and the translation department. But even then, we were just lost in this huge, huge sea, this massive institution. So our briefing was pretty straightforward. They wanted a single user interface or a single user experience on one platform. Keep in mind that this ConveyUX, I don't know if you're familiar with that site, it launched in 2011, had huge praise all over the internet. It was revolutionary. Our digital transformation program was largely based on that. They actually, the leaders of our project went to the UK, talk to them about what they did and how they can implement it in the EU. And so really our briefing was, do GovUK for Europe, please. But they also wanted to be more relevant to their users and speak to them more on their level and address their needs. And of course, they wanted to be more cost effective to also help their public perception as well. It's kind of doing their own internal austerity measures. But don't say austerity at the EU, that's a dirty word. So we settled in and started digging in, as a web person usually does. You start reading the previous research that's been done, you start looking around the organization and talking to people, and our intake took 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. We were doing interviews, stakeholder interviews, things like that. And the sheer amount of content was just the first thing that was overwhelming. There wasn't actually a way to count the number of websites that they had. It was all self-reported and very out of date. The last count was over 500, but to be honest, it could have been twice as many. There were a lot of websites hosted off the EC domain, so the closest estimate we had was more than 500. The number of, yeah, something like that. The number of stakeholders was also really breathtaking. I mean, if you count all those different departments and multiply them by 42, there were hundreds or even thousands of people who either needed to have a stake in this transformation that we were going to do or wanted to be involved in some way. And another thing that we learned was just the hierarchy of EU management was much more stacked and much more powerful than we ever thought that it would be. There's layers and layers and layers of management, and some layers, as a lowly contractor, we weren't even allowed to speak to. We couldn't be in the same room as them. It's sometimes, as an American, it's a little hard to understand because we try to be a little more democratic, but you have to imagine a lot of European countries still have royal families, and I definitely got that vibe sometimes, that there was sort of this image of royalty there. And it came up very often. I would hear the phrase, "our political masters," which just makes me cringe, but it's the way that they talk about their bosses and their hierarchy there. Eventually, after a little while, we realized that there's just no way that we're going to sit down and figure out what to do. There's no sketching the vision and starting to create a path to it. There's no strategy that we could just put in place. We were just going to have to get started working without a clear-cut vision and just see where it took us. So I found this definition of strategy in life sciences that I really like, and it reminded me a lot of the European Commission. Large organizations like this don't transform. There's no revolution here. They evolve slowly, and each little baby step forward has its own level of blood, sweat, and tears that it needs to move the institution forward. So considering the size and complexity of the EC, of the Commission, our role was not going to be just prancing in and drawing some wireframes and telling them what to do. Our role was going to be mostly education and change management. And as a UX designer at the time, this was actually really my first introduction to change management, even as a term. But over the next 2 years, it quickly grew to become the single most important part of my job and the dominating factor of my career now. And this presentation will actually focus a lot on what we did in terms of change management. The one thing that we could control and that we started with was the way that we were going to work. So we basically started there. And we knew that with the way that Commission is set up and how large it is, we were going to have to work in a lot of different ways. So the first way was we knew that we were going to have to work both from the bottom up and from the top down. And stakeholder involvement was going to make or break this project, because with 50,000 employees and incidentally 40,000 unique visitors per month to all of those different websites that we could count, even if we managed to design a new design or a new communication strategy, there's no way we were going to be able to implement anything without a lot of help from the stakeholders. So we knew that the bottom, they're the closest to the users, and they're the closest to actually implementing changes. So they really needed to be the owners of the user experience, and we had to empower them to really own that. But the top owns the mandate. They're the ones that can really steer the strategy, encourage their network below them to pay attention and follow what we're doing, and obviously also help to allocate the budgets and allow us to even use the resources that are below them. Next, we knew that we were going to have to work in a couple different ways. One, we were going to have to emulate the organization very closely. Governments work very methodically. They have to. They make decisions that affect hundreds of millions of lives, and they're very thorough, inclusive, and statistically significant. So we knew that we were going to have to work that way as well if we were going to be able to get their attention and work with them. But on the other hand, we also wanted to demonstrate a way of working that would allow us to also move very fast, to try new things, to continuously improve, and we knew that we also had to show our work very quickly and early if we were going to establish ourselves as design leaders amongst this organization. And, come on. And we also knew that the scope was going to be a major issue, so we decided to go both broad and very narrow. Before we started, the team had already launched a couple of quick pilot projects just to test out a few things, and they were working individually with departments. But the problem was that each department had still so much content and so much complexity that it really sapped resources, and we knew that that just was not going to be able to scale. We couldn't hire hundreds of people to do this. So one of the scariest decisions that we had to make early on was we decided to just tackle the entire commission all at the same time. But this actually, as scary as it was, it gave us a lot of advantages because we could basically take 42 demanding complex clients and turn them into one demanding complex client. We knew that this would also give us a lot of visibility early on. As they were running the pilot programs, almost no other departments knew what we were doing or who we were or what we were about. And it also gave us the advantage to help them see the EU from the user's perspective. We were working on an assumption here, but our assumption was that most users don't know the internal organizational structure of the Commission. They just see the EU. Like, they make laws, they give us money, we don't care about how you organize yourselves. And so by working, instead of department by department, we were able to really show them, like, people just care about the EU. And lastly, it also gave us the advantage of being able to work in a very neutral position. So instead of kind of marching into a department and saying, hey, we're here to design your content, we could be much more in the position of a facilitator to help bring together all of the departments to help them work together. But you can't do everything all at once. So the next thing that we did was try to be very rational about how much we could accomplish in the first couple steps. This is a digital maturity model that was created by one of the departments at the EC that we adopted. I actually recommend digital maturity models if you're not using them. They can really help your work in a lot of ways, even if it's for small projects. They really help to manage expectations, to manage change, and they can really help you from losing your mind or becoming discouraged if things are moving slowly, or if things aren't just, if you're not able to kind of jump from a 2 to a 5 and do this amazing user experience all at once. Because after looking at this and assessing what we knew from the departments, we realistically felt that in a year or two, we could maybe get everyone at a solid 2. Now, there were definitely departments that were working at a 3 or even a 3.5, but there was still a lot at a 1, and we just wanted to ensure that we were working consistently with everyone. Okay, so once we established the way that we wanted to work, we decided that we also wanted to start from the bottom-up approach, because this could help us lay a lot of really great foundations for also working top-down. So the goals for this were, we really wanted to kind of own the numbers, the users, and the stakeholders from the beginning so that we really had control and could take a leadership position. We knew that we wanted to create our own numbers and do our own user research, so we have that. We wanted to work in everyone so that we had power in numbers so that if we want to show something to the upper hierarchy, we can say we have everyone behind us. And we also wanted to control the metrics so that we weren't beholden to KPIs that maybe we didn't feel were very necessary to users or good for user experience. A lot of times, if you have to adopt KPIs of an organization, there are things like page views and blah, and frankly, page views say nothing about the satisfaction of a user. So that's the reason why we wanted to start bottom up. We chose an established methodology to get us started. If you have questions about this specifically, you can talk to me afterwards. It's called the Top Tasks methodology. It's been around for about 15 years. It was invented by this Irish guy named Jerry McGovern. It's been time tested with hundreds of organizations as big as Google and Cisco and GovUK and the Government of Canada. I'll just kind of briefly go through the main steps. What you do is you start by doing a very shallow content audit of all of the content that you're going to consider, but from a user task perspective. And you start to write down tasks that users could accomplish or want to accomplish with the content that the Commission is providing. We also looked at other EU websites, and we also looked at some other sources as well to try to see if there was anything out there that maybe the Commission wasn't covering that users wanted them to cover. But basically, you just start listing tasks. And for the Commission, I think our task list eventually got over 8,000 long. It was very big Excel spreadsheets. But that's just to kind of get you started so that you're documenting everything. And the Commission loves documenting. Next, what you do is you hold workshops with your stakeholders, and this is where you really start to bring in the masses and you say, okay, help us crunch this content because 8,000 tasks is unmanageable. So what we do is we go through and we eliminate redundancies and we start categorizing tasks and crunching them into more umbrella tasks until we can get down to a more manageable number. Now, for us, the manageable number was under 80, and we got to 77. It took about 3 months of workshops to do this, almost daily workshops. And then we had a pretty manageable list. And then what you do is you put it in the form of a poll, and you ask users to tell you the top 5 tasks that they want to accomplish when they're visiting Commission websites. And what that gives you is a ranked list of all of the content from a task perspective, from a user perspective, of all the content of the EC, so that at least, if nothing else, you have a really solid starting point. Now, I realize that our keynote speaker this morning was saying some things about user surveys. So I'll just acknowledge that. We knew that this was not going to be our only tactic in terms of user research, but it gave us a really solid, good place to start because we could create a roadmap from this survey. And frankly, businesses and institutions, they love numbers. So that's why we decided to do a survey. But this accomplished a lot. So it was very bottom up because we started first from the users and the content that existed, and then we engaged the stakeholders to crunch through all of these lists. But it also set the foundation for working top down because we could also show that we were doing this massive due diligence and this inclusivity and had this very strict process that we were using. It was also very methodical because no one had ever attempted to document all of the content, much less the user tasks of the Commission, and we had a very statistically significant survey. But it also laid the foundation for our more agile approach because since it was task-based, we could therefore move quickly into doing user journeys and doing service design around these tasks as well. Obviously, it was very broad because we started with all of the tasks across the Commission in a very neutral list, but it was also very narrow because once we had our user ranking, there were some very clear top tasks that emerged that we could make a big case for starting with and spending a lot of resources on. Now, while we were doing this, we snuck in some little change management tricks, which hopefully you'll find interesting and useful. First, once we had the task list, we sent it around to all the departments and said, tell us which tasks your department contributes to. And then we kept that information till later. And then we went and we dove deeper into our content audit, and we mapped every task to the actual content on the site. Now, this is not something that every organization can do. It took 30 people 3 months working full-time to actually accomplish this. But by the end, we went at least 3 levels deep in the navigation, and were able to map almost every page of content to one of our tasks. So we could own that. And then the third, which I think is a really cool trick, which always works really well for me, is we also gave the same survey to internal users at the commission, except we asked them, what do you think the top 5 tasks are for your users? And this is really great. Anytime, especially if you're experiencing a lot of resistance internally, if you can get some user research in your budget, mimic it internally so that you can show them the difference between the way that they use their products or their websites and the way that users do. And it really helps to eliminate a lot of that like opinion-based discussion that goes back and forth, like I think the website should be like this, and you can really show them that they see things differently than other people. Okay, so I'll first show you the top tasks according to our stakeholders. I personally find this to be kind of a sad list. Funding is at the top, of course. They just think everybody wants their money. Working in jobs is naturally very high. Just a little bit of insight. I think that this is high on the internal list because the previous president, Barroso, his main campaign when he was in office was on jobs and growth, and the new president that was coming in, President Juncker, his top priorities was also about jobs and economy and growth. So I think that they were already seeing like, well, this is the stuff that we work on, so people must care about our campaigns. So that's why this was so high. Complaints is just kind of sad, like the fact that they think that that's a top task of their users is, they already know that maybe they're not doing a great job. And then about the commission, of course, back to the navel gazing, they think that people really care about who the commission is and how the way they work and stuff like that. So now I'll show you the actual top tasks. We had over 107,000 respondents to this survey, and 45,000 people signed up to do further testing. I always like to say those numbers because we had like a huge party, and whenever I talk about those numbers, like any UX researcher in the room like pees their pants. I can hear it. So it was, granted, it was self-reported tasks, a self-reported survey. However, these were huge numbers and a massive amount of data that we could work with. And I was actually kind of, this is a very heartening list. I really like it. It's positive. It shows that the users at least know what the commission does. They make laws and legislation, they fund research and innovation, and they set the EU strategy and political priorities. The funny ones that came out, which were pretty shocking to a lot of people at the Commission, were the education and environmental protection. I think these are great tasks to have in your top list, your top 25%, but they were pretty shocking because they were very close to policy departments, and you can imagine a lot of other policy departments that did not wind up in the top tasks were pretty pissed and thinking that they were going to get their budgets cut. So it was a bit controversial, but it is what it is. The main findings that came out of this that I think were pretty profound for the EU was that 80% use the websites for work. So we're talking about people, we're not talking about sort of the generic European citizen coming to find out how the Commission is working for them. We're talking about people who need this content in order to accomplish tasks in their daily work. And so this really shows that the EU is not a publisher. They're not here to just tell people about what they're doing and get people to like them. They're a service provider, which they've never really considered themselves to be before. Actionable content really dominated, which also helped make the case for service design, but all of sort of the academics and the self-promotion and the internal stuff was all at the bottom of the list. The top of the list was all very action-oriented content. And I think the most profound finding was that the top tasks were identical almost across the board, regardless of demographics, regardless of the industry that the user worked in, regardless of the country that they were from. India had the same top tasks as Belgium, no matter what language they spoke. Whether they were unemployed, all of the top tasks were the same. So while the Commission spent a lot of time talking about how diverse their audience is and how they need to have 500 plus websites to tailor to their specific needs, what this showed is that actually no, one architecture can serve the entire user base. And then we had our sneaky findings. So, no surprise, they were wrong about the top tasks, and so we could basically just say, you're wrong, you see things different, no more arguments, let's move forward. The other thing is that we found that each task is, no surprise, shared by multiple departments. In fact, every task was shared by an average of 12 departments. So they were going to have to break down their silos. If they were going to meet user needs, they needed to work together. And then third, the most sneaky ones, is we were the only ones who really knew where all that content exists across all departments. So it really allowed us to take the lead in creating a governance around these tasks, and to really take the lead on designing the contents. So that team kind of set off on creating a common architecture. The first thing was just to get things in order and create that architecture, and then they could focus on services. They had a lot of work in aligning the vision and culture around the correct audience, and then they started to hopefully, I think they're still working on it, create a governance structure to help manage this. So that's our bottom-up approach. It's still in process. The top-down was much more about showcasing. So once we had these numbers, we had a lot of clouds. But we also had another project that we kind of snuck in, and we had really fortunate timing because we were there during an administration change. The previous president was President Barroso. We started during his last year in office, so he wasn't really paying attention to us, and so we were doing a ton of research on their content, actually. We had an idea that when the new administration came in, we could just present them with a new template for their page, basically what they get to say to users. Because commissioners used to get their own website, and a lot of them were just these vanity projects that were very expensive to maintain, and a lot of times, because of this hierarchical top-down structure, anytime they wanted to change on their website, everybody had to drop their projects and do whatever they said. So it was a pain in the ass for people to maintain these websites. It was expensive. And so our idea was just to have them come in. We had all this research, and then we already had a design template ready for them to go, and we could just rationalize those sites. So we did, and it actually was quite a successful project. No one in the departments thought that we would be able to do this. They're like, no way are these political masters going to allow you to control their content. They're going to throw a big fit. But actually, it was successful, and the people who were actually reviewing designs and giving us feedback were the cabinet of the president. So by just this one project, we were able to already get a seat at basically the president's table and to start demonstrating new design principles from the top down. And we did such a good job, they asked us to keep going, and they asked us to design the new homepage for the European Commission. No, they were very much in the driver's seat when it came to design, so don't be too harsh. There was a lot of compromises. And then they asked us to also start designing the political priority, the plant in the graphic there, to design the political priorities for the president. So basically what we became was sort of the digital agency for the presidents and the commissioners of the commission. Now, on one hand, that sounds really great. We were getting a lot of exposure. People were really impressed with what we were doing. All of this seemed like a very great success. But there were some unexpected consequences of this. There was a huge elephant in the room that we were kind of in denial of up until this point and really failed to fully acknowledge. So, remember earlier when I said we couldn't show the bottom of the task list? The content that came in last, so the content that was voted the least useful to users, was the president and the commissioners. So that was a bit awkward. On one hand, we had two concurrent tracks, one of them working on redesigning the president and the commissioners. That was the content that we started with. And on the other hand, we had a track that basically said, this is the least important content. I mean, on one hand, we did rationalize it so that a lot of people could spend a lot less time and money dealing with it, but at the same time, yeah, it was a little bit awkward. And it really caused a squeeze in the middle of not only our the people working on our program, but actually the management of our program. Imagine being in charge of a project that puts you in the hot seat between your political masters who are praising you and telling you you're doing a great job and asking you to do all this design for them, and then every single department in the commission who knows what users actually want and are also expecting you to respond to those needs as well and to work with them. It's a really tight squeeze, and it's a really difficult position politically to be put in. And this is where the momentum of the entire program started to grind to a halt, actually. Now, we kept moving, but as we kept going, more political problems came up. So the research and information architecture team had taken the top tasks list, and they started to go through a series of remote card sorting tests and having the users put it into an architecture. And this is one version of the architecture that they wanted to put, in the main menu on the homepage. This is the most important content to users. But there's a lot of really tricky things in here. So for instance, I mentioned before, education is a very tiny department. They have almost nothing to do with policy or legislation in Europe, but they have one massively popular program that allows students to study abroad called Erasmus. So that's probably why it was up there. Environment was also kind of controversial because there isn't actually an environment department, but this is how users wanted to group things like energy efficiency and climate change. But this really upset departments like climate change because, we put this sort of generic label on them and they're climate change and they should be in the lineup. And then the third really controversial one, which really became our chink in the armor, was economy didn't show up anywhere in here. It was very closely related to business tasks and things, and it didn't show up anywhere specifically, but it showed up everywhere generally, but it wasn't something that came out of the card sort. And so to have President Barroso run a platform based on economy and jobs, and then have President Juncker come in and run his platform on the basis of economy and jobs, to not have economy on the homepage was just not allowed. And actually, that was the very first compromise that we were forced to make, was we had to change business, we just kind of crammed it in there, business and economy. And that really caused a lot of upset with our bottom stakeholders, because they were like, well, if they can change the architecture, then why can't we change the architecture? And then it just started to kind of snowball from there. Another track that we were working on was creating a beta that was supposed to launch last summer. And it was basically kind of the top level, the homepage and all of sort of the top level of the navigation, the main sections of the navigation. It also included some more rationalization work that we wanted to do on sort of the institutional content. So here you see we kind of extrapolated our learnings from the commissioner pages and tried to do the same for the departments. A lot of departments had these huge websites that no one ever visited. And so we also wanted to go to a single template for all the departments. And we got started on this, but then suddenly there was this political sensitivity where suddenly the communications department is coming along and telling energy how to design their pages, and it just started to ignite all kinds of other controversy as well. And so as we went, and mind you, the energy department never complained about this. No department ever complained about this. This was our own management feeling the political crunch and the political pressure and anticipating backlash. And they basically just started to edit and censor and block contents until really we just wound up with a black box of a beta. It still exists. We're still working on it. No one's allowed to see it. And it's about 7-8 months late, and we're not actually sure if it's ever going to launch. In the meantime, to respond to to try to be empathetic with our management staff, we've launched another track called the Fast Track, and it's a bit more focused on trying to appeal to their sensitivities around budget and finances, because middle management is usually the ones that are beholden to managing budgets, and they have numbers that they have to come in on. And we have some really expensive old platforms that are being supported by the IT department. So in order to help them out, we basically said, okay, we'll start migrating content to the new platform quickly so that we can at least get rid of these old CMSs and these old platforms and start saving some money in the hopes that they'll be able to get their numbers in. It'll make them look good to both the top and the bottom, and then somehow maybe we can continue forward with the work that we're doing. So I realize that I'm ending this presentation on a bit of a dark note. We're not sure what's going to happen in 2016. We still have a staff of 40 people working on this project. They're still continuing all of this. We just can't show it yet, and we just have to figure out a way to empower our management and our team to be able to really just push forward and be a visionary leader and just try to power through this. I think there's time for questions, but actually if you also have recommendations for the team, I'm sure they would love to hear them, because yeah, we're at an impasse. But that's what comes with digital transformation. Sometimes you can't plan for everything, and you just have to just have to go. So questions? You were first. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for presenting this. It's a really interesting case study that probably few of us have ever get a chance to do something like this. I work at University of Washington, which in some ways organizationally is very similar to this.
Yeah.
And we look at student-facing content, and it's a bunch of fiefdoms.
Yeah.
The question I have for you is, to what degree did you guys, or how did you communicate out to the organization to let them know about your process? Was that, I know that I've seen like ERP implementations on other campuses where they'll set up a website and sort of, set up a timeline, much like you see big transportation projects do. I'm wondering if you guys did anything like that.
No, it's old school, to be honest. We went to a lot of meetings and made a lot of phone calls. It was like grassroots, actually.
Yeah.
Made a lot of phone calls, made a lot of contacts who knew people, and drank a lot of coffee. One thing that comes along with change management is going out to coffee and just talking about your projects and getting people on board. And so I would say that took... some of that was already happening when we first started because, like I said, there were some pilot projects going on. As part of those pilot projects, they were also just reaching out to any web team that would talk to them, inviting them to come to our office and just say, what do you want from a new platform, and just listening. So we had a pretty good contacts list. We just crunched through it and started basically keeping track of who was on board, who was off board, who knew whom, that kind of thing. Grassroots activism. Yeah. Let's go with you, sorry, first, and then you.
So who is actually deciding? I think that's the biggest problem. I used to work in a big bank in Brussels as well, by the way. But the problem was we had like 75 stakeholders, and it was not really clear who has actually the decision power. So basically, it leads to this that actually nobody is deciding. So that's why you have an impasse, kind of. So how are you solving this?
Nobody decides. That's the crazy thing. It blew my mind, was that there was really no decider on this project, and no one would really stand up to do it. There were managers who were in charge of things, but again, I think it's the nature of a political organization. No one ever really wants to sign their name on the dotted line in case it might come back to them later on, and you just can't. You just have to. Everything is just a web of politics. Who knows who's going to let you go far, going to help you out. It's like House of Cards. Yeah.
So I am working on the Canada site. So
you are. I talked to someone from you, months ago. What's your name?
And
Maybe it was you.
we kind of got to the same place. There's what we call affectionately a project reset happening right now.
Yeah.
Which in IT speak means, we're just in timeframes, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we had in our favor was that the policy suite is also being updated to help support us. So the new comms policy for Government Canada is actually pointing to our style guide and our specification
Nice.
as source documents that they must comply with.
Yeah.
So we have this huge leverage from a policy side. Do you have any of that?
A bit. It was kind of coupled with our beta track, is that we were working on publishing a library of components that people would use. It was this hot potato that got passed back and forth. We had the Internet Provider's Guide, which was basically the style guide or the design guide for all digital communications. Originally, it was given to us so that we could start to rewrite it and rework it, and then it was kind of taken away, and then there was a political scramble about it, and we had to work with like 3 different teams to try to get anything passed. We're slowly chipping away at it, but we still don't have a mandate. And again, like we have a component library. It's reflected in the designs that we're doing, but it's not published yet because since there's no decider, there's sort of no one knows who's able to approve this stuff and to actually get it on the provider's guide. So it's just kind of stuck in this no man's land. But there was some reorganization in the structure when President Juncker came in. Actually, I kind of admire some of the things that he did structurally with the Commission, because one of the criticisms of the Commission's work is that they just over-legislate and they're working in too many legislative areas that are better handled by national governments. And he said, we're not going to do that anymore. I'm going to lay out 10 priorities, and he reorganized all of the departments underneath them, and he also pulled the communications department out and made them a presidential department. So I think it's still kind of in theory, not in practice, but hopefully someday people will start to see the comms department as sort of this umbrella that is supporting all of the departments below or above it. I don't want to say below, above it. But I think that'll take some years for people to get used to and actually start doing. But yeah.
So current state right now, what would you say is the biggest obstacle to just a release for this beta that you have?
Just the fear in middle management.
So what would
Yeah.
second question, what would the repercussions be if you just launched it under the cover of night?
How many times I've dreamed of that? No, like we had like covert operations. Sometimes I really wish we could do that. To be honest, people would probably freak out for a little while and then get over it, you know, in my opinion. But
It sounds like to me.
it's not my call to make. So
That might be what they want you to do. Nobody has to sign.
someone just sneaks in at night and plugs it in. I would love to do that. To be honest, we have bartered and bickered over this. We offered to do just an internal alpha launch, so only internal commission people can see it and just give feedback, and that was vetoed. We definitely always wanted it to be a standalone next to, so it wouldn't actually replace any current content. So the existing website would still stand, but the new one would be next to it. The problem with that is that they were afraid that the president's cabinet would be confused or offended because they helped design the live homepage, and this is our homepage. Yeah. So I don't know.
Sounds like a
There would probably be a compromise in the end, but it would be a bit of a shitstorm until then. But you know what? Sometimes you just have to live through a shitstorm. And I'm all for the shitstorm, but I think there was one other person over here. Otherwise, no? Okay.
So you talked about doing daily workshops over 3 months.
Yeah.
You had the stakeholders winnow down the 8,000 task.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get stakeholders to meetings for 3 months, to daily meetings?
It wasn't all of them all the time. So we basically chunked the content into different chunks, and then we had a big list of stakeholders and where they were and who we thought would be a good contributor. We had to beg a lot of times, and especially we had to beg bosses who, like the person wanted to participate, but their boss didn't want to allocate the resource. It was nitty-gritty. I mean, it was not like a smooth process, but we always had at least 4 or 5 people in those sessions. Once the survey results came in and people were blown away by the numbers, we started doing co-creation workshops on the information architecture steps, and those often had up to 100 people. But again, it was just whoever could kind of beg off and get the time from their boss. Yeah, I think one more. I guess I started late, but that's okay. I don't want to.
So there was a champion in the UK, right,
Mhm.
who wrote letter to government, and then there was a champion minister.
Yeah.
Who was your champion?
We did not have one, and that was that. When I said that there was the middle management squeeze was something that we anticipated for a long time, it's that, and we just knew that we weren't going to get a mandate. We didn't have a visionary leader. I'm not insulting anyone because I think that you have to have a lot of balls and a lot of clout to be able to have that role, and we just didn't have it in this program. We had lower level management who didn't have a lot of influence leading us. And yeah, we never had a mandate. It sucks. I wish we did. We were hoping to get one after we launched our beta, but we'll see. I think I don't want to make the next person late, so I'll end it there. But thanks so much for coming, and let me know afterwards if you want to talk more.